Welcome once again to Cherry Bekaert's Technology Podcast Series, exploring how technology companies can get started working with the federal government and how to do so successfully. Today, we're joined once again with Craig Hunter and Eric Poppe, two members of Cherry Bekaert's government contracting group. Craig and Eric are going to talk about how to stay compliant with the government as your technology company continues to grow and win more contracts. Please enjoy this conversation.
Thank you, Maggie, and Eric, great to have you again with me here today. In our last podcast, you mentioned the approved accounting system and the treatment of different types of costs. So picking up right there, can we kick off with that?
Yeah, happy to. And Craig, it's great to join you again talking about getting into government contracting if you're a technology company. And like you mentioned last time, we talked about how there are a lot of different compliance requirements. If you, depending on that contract type, fixed price, time material, or cost plus, and what's that big cultural hurdle of timekeeping if you're doing work with the government, and drilling down from there. And just kind of, as you mentioned, starting off with the accounting system, those contract types are really help drive what you as a company might have to implement or start to track, or when it comes to reporting, accounting, and compliance requirements. And if you have a T&M contract or a cost plus contract, really flexibly priced contract is how the government labels it, you are supposed to have, your accounting system is supposed to be set up in a way that meets the criteria of what the government expects you to be able to do to properly accumulate, allocate, and allocate costs and bill costs to the government for these contracts. So if you have a cost reimbursable contract or a T&M contract, you will at some point have the requirement to have an approved accounting system. And when we talk about accounting systems from a GovCon standpoint, we're not talking about just the ERP system. We're not talking about NetSuite or QuickBooks or Oracle or whatever you use as your accounting system, but we're talking about the system, the people, the processes, the controls, the training. Kind of think of it as if you think of the accounting system as a full wheel, each spoke of the wheel is a different piece of that: training, compliance, ethics, accounting, accumulation, GL control, all of that. And the requirements that the government puts out hits on all those different topics. So if you're just getting into work with the federal government, you want a cost plus contract, or you're about to win, you might be asked to get an approved accounting system by either being audited by the government or having a third party. And those criteria is based off of something called the SF 1408, which is the Pre-Award Accounting System Survey. This is backed up from a FAR clause, Federal Acquisition Regulation Clause, as well. So when we think of accounting systems, the items that you have to really consider to be compliant is, identifying direct cost versus indirect cost, having a timekeeping system that properly tracks contract costs and non-contract costs to the appropriate cost objective, or think of it as home for that labor, billing appropriately and being able to show cumulative billed amount to contracts and clients, identifying unallowables and removing unallowables from any potential claim to government, and then being able to track contract funding and costs appropriately for that award and be able to show that. And then lastly, be per GAAP.
Right.
So I know that was a lot that I just went through there.
A lot that you addressed. So I've seen a number of companies where they have QuickBooks and they're, looking at government contracting. They say, well, my system is super simple, being QuickBooks, and then they think it's not going to be a system that can be compliant. But we can, and companies can put certain, processes in place such that QuickBooks could be a compliant system and could pass the government audit. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. So you can, depending on your system, if you're using QuickBooks Online or if you're using a desktop version, there are different features that you can use within the system and also use outside the system, being more manual in nature. using Excel spreadsheets for rate calculations and et cetera, that you can use and implement to become compliant and track appropriately to hit those requirements. There are a lot of third-party tools too, and apps and bolt-ons to QuickBooks that you can put on that help to track that compliance piece as well. Really, from a QuickBooks standpoint, and if you're just getting into, even if you're on a different system, not QuickBooks, but you're not set up for government contracting, it really comes down to being able to track contract cost and get down to that level of detail. And the contract can be broken up into contract line items, and that could be a requirement as well to track costs to that level and be able to track materials, labor, travel, other direct costs, and so on, all to that contract line item level that rolls up into the contract. So it's really just a very detailed project cost accounting system is a lot of these reporting requirements.
Right, and you mentioned direct versus indirect costs. So just touching on that briefly, direct costs being those costs that are specific to a particular contract or contract line item, and indirect costs being those costs that perhaps benefit a pool of contracts or just the general and administrative part of the company as a whole. Typically, indirect costs would be at a simple level, there would be three pools. There'd be fringe costs, which are costs of supporting the payroll. There would be overhead costs and G&A costs. And the key is that the company really understands all their costs as they're putting them into the system, because the government could ultimately be auditing that. So they want to make sure any costs that are going to a particular contract line are indeed valid contract costs, direct, and then also indirect, right?
Yeah, you nailed it. Direct costs being contractor program specific costs. It's costs that support a single cost objective. So the way to think of it is, if you got rid of that contract, got rid of that program, or internal project too, that cost would not occur. Indirect costs support a number of different cost objectives. So like you said, fringe being benefits, overhead supporting the revenue generating activities, or G&A supporting the organization as a whole. So and if you removed a couple of those programs, you would still incur that like recruiting cost, because you still have to function. Yep, that's correct.
Good. And Eric, also you mentioned allowable and unallowable costs. So could you at a high level maybe give some examples of those costs that are unallowable, and unallowable being that the government is saying, these costs are incurred by the company, but we're not going to reimburse you for these or allow you to make any kind of markup on these types of costs, right?
Yeah, happy to. And this is there's definitely some gray area in this too. So the federal acquisition regulations, the FAR Part 31, is the cost principles for commercial organizations. And there they list these different types of buckets of cost, public relations as an example, or marketing, legal, professional fees, entertainment as just a few examples, as types of costs that could be allowable or unallowable. And kind of the rule of thumb is, and you have two levels of this. You have expressly unallowable. These are the things that are never allowed to be billed to the government and claimed. They are can still be considered normal business expenses from a commercial standpoint, like a company party, and where there might be alcohol served. But from a billing standpoint, you can't try to pass those on to the government. So you have to identify that and segregate it out of your claim. So kind of rule of thumb, anything fun can't bill to the government. So, if you're taking a potential client out to we're in the DC area to a Washington Nationals game, you can't take those tickets and, put them in as a G&A entertainment cost. No alcohol, no things like that. Lobbying costs you can't bill. There's some public relations and marketing that you can't bill and claim. But FAR Part 31 gives examples of what you can push and claim that is allowable, and other examples that are definitely not allowable, that you cannot push through.
Right. So while they're valid costs of doing business, the government just does not recognize them such that they'll reimburse.
Correct. And one thing just to add, this is different than IRS reporting. So, right. These are not one for one.
Right. So we've got in, so let's assume we've got in all our costs, Eric, into our system. We've, allocated them direct and indirect. Now, when it comes to billing or invoicing the government, how does that differ from a commercial practice?
That's a great question. And going back to actually our last podcast, we talked about where understanding your terms of the contract itself, the contract will be very specific on how you need to bill. And depending on the contract and that contract type, typically you need to be showing at a contract level and potentially a CLIN level, so broken down in more detail, show your direct cost. You have to show your indirect costs that are applied to those direct costs. You need to show the hours that were worked, and then fee to have your total amount that you're billing. That's a cost reimbursable. For cumulative, for a T&M, typically you always have to show the labor rates, show the hours, show any materials. But typically it's at a lower level of detail than what you might see in a commercial organization. You might also have to put other things on the invoice like period of performance, funding, funding spent, cumulative build to date, and the rates to the indirect rates. So, but a lot of this goes back to what's required for the contract itself, because there it will tell you what level of detail you have to bill at.
Good. So when we're billing and working with the government, what are the people on the government side or the levels or the titles of people that we're going to be working with on a regular basis as we work through this contract?
So in your contract, it will list, the person with all the decision power is the contracting officer in the end. They're the ones that, give thumbs up, down, sign modifications, approve changes in key personnel. They're the ones with the power. With there, you might have folks, contracting officer, technical representative, or another, or other folks who support that contracting officer. They're the ones that without the contracting officer, though, is the one with decision-making power. You have some support from DCAA and DCMA who might perform audits or reviews for a company, on a company, and then give their reports to that contracting officer. But the contracting officer is really the one that you should really be trying to develop relationships with, and they're the ones with the overarching power to approve your system, sign modifications, award the contracts, and interpret whatever DCAA or any other audit findings have and make a decision on it.
So based on what you said earlier about unallowable costs, we to grow the relationship, we can't buy them a bottle of wine, right? To help them.
As much as we would want to, and as much as fun as it could be, no, sadly.
Right. Eric, you mentioned types of contract and what individuals are buying. So as we wrap up and close down this session, one of the items that certainly with technology companies they're concerned about is the commerciality and the intellectual property, and at any point is that going to go across to the government? So this is a bigger topic in of itself. So I encourage everyone to join us for our next and fifth podcast in the series as we will address that intellectual property and commerciality. So Eric, thank you so much for your input and time, and thank you very much, everyone.